I'm Fonzo.
And I'm Eliza.
And we're the co-host of Grown, a podcast from the Moth that shows we're never fully grown.
Growing up feels like a phase that should end at some point, but does it ever really? Whether you're 16 or 26 or 86, you're gonna have to deal with family drama, your body, and the type of person you want to be. So why not put it all out in the open and go through it together?
Join us every other week to deal with cringe, culture, and the courageous efforts of people like you to get grown.
Start listening today. Follow Grown on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.
There is no scarier place to be vulnerable than in the bedroom. Expressing our likes, dislikes, boundaries, and limitations, all while trying to stay in the moment. Conversations outside the bedroom about sex are a close second. Discussing sexual history, sexual trauma, and sexual health can open you up to a lot of questions, concerns, and judgments. And this is why God made friends. Friends you can count on to walk you through a trial run of uncomfortable conversations. Because what happens in book club, or wine club, or book club where wine is the central focus, happens in a safe space. At least that's been my experience. It was in one of these small circles that I was first introduced to the complicated dynamics of a herpes diagnosis. It's an STI that is incredibly common and especially stigmatized. But it doesn't have to be, which is why it's on all of us to learn more about all bodies, including those that aren't our own. This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. I don't know about y'all, but my high school sex ed class did a terrible job talking about herpes. I didn't walk away with much knowledge, but the takeaways I did have conjured doom and gloom and left me with the notion that herpes was a lifelong curse of painful blisters and a bad sex life. These are similar to the assumptions Ella Dawson had as a young adult. Ella was just shy of her 21st birthday when she woke up with an outbreak of genital herpes. At first, she thought maybe this was shaving gone wrong. But then she started to wonder if it was something more sinister and took her concerns to the student health clinic on her college campus.
The doctors there were very kind, but said, this is absolutely herpetic. Welcome to the secret society.
This secret society is larger than you might think. An estimated 1 in 8 people in the U.S. carries the strand of herpes virus that most commonly causes genital herpes. But so many of us still know so little about it. And that's where the fears and misconceptions come in. We quickly fill in the blanks with what we've heard about the STI. Ella Dawson is now a sex and culture critic. Understanding her diagnosis was not just an education. It was an emotional journey.
It was a traumatic experience, even though I received such good care. A herpes diagnosis can throw you into such an identity crisis because I had spent my entire life absorbing all of these horrible stereotypes about the type of person who got STIs. I struggled with insecurity and confusion and guilt and embarrassment, and it was incredibly disruptive, and it absolutely ruined my 21st birthday. But there are a lot of stereotypes that we learn through sex education or just from pop culture that the type of person who gets an STI, especially herpes, is someone who has been reckless, someone who is irresponsible and selfish. Usually we associate it with infidelity and deception. So there's this real sense that if you have an STI, you have some kind of moral failing.
Maybe you could tell us a bit about the process of uncovering how the virus manifests in your own body and learning how to manage that.
It took me a long time and the help of some wonderful supportive partners, as well as just educating myself to understand that the virus lives in my body and my body is still me, and the virus is one part of my body. I also get sinus infections, and I don't judge my nose for being useless.
Time for a little sex ed booster, because I know we all could use it. There are 8 types of the herpes virus that affect humans, and 2 that are relevant to our sexual health. Herpes simplex virus type 1 and herpes simplex type 2. The odds that we've come into contact with one or both of them are fairly high. Both strands of the virus can cause oral and genital herpes, but there are some big differences between the 2 virus types. About 12% of U.S. adults have HSV2. It's the most common cause of genital herpes and can lead to a higher frequency of outbreaks. HSV1, on the other hand, most often leads to oral herpes, and more than 50% of U.S. adults carry the virus. So why aren't we all constantly walking around with cold sores or painful blisters? That's because the majority of people with either type of HSV show no symptoms or only mild ones. And though outbreaks can be painful, recurrent episodes are shorter, less severe, and more infrequent over time. Considering all the bad info I and so many others left school with, I think we deserve a little expert insight now.
Before we had culture and PCR tests where we could check for the DNA of the virus, or even blood tests that will allow us to detect antibodies, it was a visual diagnosis. So it required someone coming in with lesions and someone being able to look at it and say, that's herpes.
Peter Leone is a professor of medicine in the Department of Infectious Diseases at UNC Chapel Hill. And he told me that our medical knowledge about how to diagnose and treat herpes is still evolving.
We then had cultures. The cultures were relatively insensitive and weren't being done on people who did not have sores or lesions at the time that they presented. As a result, people think that if they don't have, sores and painful blisters, that they don't have herpes is really a misnomer.
Should we all get tested? I mean, it's not a part of a normal STI testing battery, so it's something you would have to ask for independently. But do you recommend that people err on the side of doing that because they may be walking around and passing it to other people without knowing it?
Yeah, we've had a lot of debate about this. I've been on the CDC STD treatment guidelines in the past, and we could never get agreement from them on making this a routine part of STI screening. I do think it's a good idea to get screened for herpes. Certainly, as you age up, the prevalence rate goes up, but that also means that your partner should know their status. So I just think that it levels the playing field to say, look, we're going to be responsible. We'll get an HIV test, we get tested for gonorrhea, chlamydia, syphilis, and we're going to get a herpes blood test.
So how are people treated who do have herpes? What can they do to reduce the risk of transmission once they know that they have a positive diagnosis?
Well, there are several things that you can do that actually do have an impact on reducing transmission and controlling disease, so the frequency of outbreaks. So one of the first things to do actually is to disclose your status. And I think it's important for a lot of reasons, both in terms of reducing stigma, but also, for whatever reason, disclosing that you have genital herpes actually does seem to reduce the risk of transmitting it to a partner, even though there aren't any changes that we know of in sexual activities or use of condoms with that sort of disclosure.
Other useful facts I learned from Peter: using condoms and not having sex during an active outbreak can help reduce the risk of herpes transmission. If you have HSV2, you can also take a daily medication to prevent outbreaks. Now, knowing your status and how to treat it is one step, but deciding how and when to talk about it, that is a whole other thing. Understandably, some people keep their status private outside their romantic partnerships. Ella, who you met earlier, took a different approach and shared her diagnosis with the world. 2 years after learning her status, she gave a TEDx talk in Connecticut. It's been watched more than 750,000 times.
It's very strange being a public figure associated with herpes. It's always funny when somebody Googles my name and then it suggests Ella Dawson herpes to complete your search. So it's definitely odd. I decided to become more public about having herpes because when I was diagnosed, all I really wanted was to see other people's real life experiences. I wanted people to relate to who weren't anonymous and who were like me, so that I had role models and felt less alone. And it's been certainly odd to have job interviews where someone Googles me, or to have a boyfriend's parents Google me. And there are occasionally people who kind of cringe and go, ew, that's disgusting. And I've certainly had moments where I've had to stand up for myself in awkward social situations. But in general, people are really gracious and grateful because it's this huge void in our conversation about health.
Being afraid of disclosing can really prevent people from having healthy and safe relationships. And it's even led to some interesting things on the internet, like herpes exclusive dating sites. So I'm curious to have you talk a bit about that and kind of what has emerged from the fact that so many people are afraid to disclose because they don't know how people are going to react.
Yeah, you're putting yourself in a vulnerable position when you tell someone, hey, this is a part of my life and I feel shame around it. Even if you know that shame is illogical, those feelings are still so powerful. And it's led to the creation of STI dating sites and dating apps. And I can understand the appeal that they have for folks who really struggle with disclosing, the idea of just having it not even be an issue. But at the same time, I personally don't use those sites. I worry that they benefit from stigma and reinforce the stigma because it encourages folks with STIs to self-segregate a little bit away from the general population. And for folks who don't have STIs, who see the existence of those sites, it underlines for them that folks who have STIs are not dateable.
I know one of the most common reasons people land on your site on Google is they are Googling, should I date someone with herpes? So, I mean, what is your approach to disclosing your status, and what are those conversations like for you?
When I was first dating as a newly diagnosed person, my approach was to get it out of the way early, mostly because I'm kind of a loudmouth person and I blurt out whatever is troubling me. And I actually really loved that approach because it saved me the awkwardness and the heartbreak of becoming really invested in someone and then having them change their mind. But I also found that when I approached the conversation from a place of curiosity and passion, of I have this virus, it's not really a big deal, it's really strange how socially stigmatized it is, and I brought an energy of excitement and not shame, I received a much better response from the person that I was disclosing to. And I think a lot of folks with herpes are dreadfully afraid of rejection and as a result can drag out disclosing or avoid it, or when they finally do disclose, they might apologize or frame it as this awful secret and this awful baggage that they're bringing to the relationship. And then that energy of shame and fear is mirrored by the person you're speaking to, who then sees it as this big scary thing and this potential deal breaker because that's how you framed it. The advice that I usually give to folks who are newly diagnosed or who are dating for the first time is don't be afraid and don't apologize, because this is just part of your life. It's just part of who you are. And at the end of the day, you are an amazing, well-rounded person. And this one piece of your life shouldn't be a reflection of everything that you bring to the relationship.
Ella's takeaways on herpes are the exact opposite of what we're fed culturally about the virus. In 2020, the cast of SNL and late-night host Jimmy Kimmel jumped on the already packed bandwagon of comedians who make herpes jokes and perpetuate the stigma that herpes is the sexual health boogeyman. The reality is, if you don't have herpes yourself, chances are you know someone who does. I've had so many conversations with friends about herpes over the years, and I recently called up one of them to talk more about her experience. She asked to remain anonymous for the show to protect her health privacy. And then we talked about all the change she hopes to see in our cultural conversations about herpes.
Okay. All right, I'm rolling. We have tons of power.
Tons of power, tons of juice. Good. Okay. I'd love, to start our conversation by talking a bit about disclosure. Tell me about how your journey with disclosure has evolved over the years, from the beginning when you first got your diagnosis, how you were talking about it with loved ones and specifically with partners at that time, to kind of where you are today. How have things evolved for you?
When I got diagnosed, it was a really traumatic event. The situation and the relationship that I was in, it was all just really, really bad. And so there was at the time for me no way to not read my diagnosis as if it was some kind of punishment for my poor judgment and low self-esteem. And there was no way for me to really talk about my diagnosis with sexual partners without also telling them the story of my horrible breakup. But that wasn't necessarily the information that was important for that person at that point in time.
So what did you kind of come to think was important to say and what was not? Versus feeling the pressure to divulge everything. How did you kind of walk that line between doing what felt comfortable to you but not sharing in a way that made you feel overexposed?
It became much more about kind of listening to them and thinking about what if I was in this situation, what would be important for me to hear, and kind of trying to speak from that perspective as opposed to oh, thank you, here's someone I can tell my story to, and just kind of trauma vomiting all over them. It became more about, well, okay, we're going to take this step and I need to initiate this conversation with you. So, I'm going to start off with a couple points, but then I just shut up and I'm what are your questions? But I do always say, please don't just go home and Google it. Ask me to send you links, because it's easy to get misinformation out there.
Totally. What are some of the best reactions that you've gotten?
The affirmative ones, the ones that are okay, well, I have some questions, but I'm still interested in you. The very best thing that anyone ever said was, I said, I was all nervous and okay, I have to tell you something. And I have herpes. And he was okay, well, I trust you to tell me what is the most safe and fun. And then we had amazing sex. So it was
love
okay,
that.
that was the best reaction.
When you started talking about it more openly with friends, what was that like? Did you find helpful advice that you got from people, or did it feel, because it's there's less of a need to know when you're talking to friends about it. So I'm curious about kind of what inspired talking about it more openly and what it was like to get that reaction.
Talking to friends about it is the best thing. You can fall down these Google holes and negative spiral thought patterns about your self-image and your worth and your desirability, and going to the circle of women usually that, have gone through this or have resources or even insight is just the best. Talking to other people, talking to doctors and talking to friends just gave me more information about something that I really didn't have a lot of actual information about, just kind of rumors and impressions and cultural fears. There's the popular online news article that's comes up right at the top of search results about what to do if you have herpes. And the conclusion of the article is abstinence is the only way to have safe sex with herpes. Abstinence. And it's just really?
What kind of change would you like to see in how it is talked about?
Yeah, I guess the change I would like to see is this moment of disclosing to a partner. 99% of the time, I'm the first person to ever tell them this, or to just bring up STD, STI, whatever status, before having sex. And definitely there's a timing question that you work out with practice or whatever, but it's such a burden on me to do that. If I could wish for one thing to be different, I would want that conversation to just be so much more natural.
The TLDR of that conversation: don't ghost on people who open up to you. You may miss out on getting to know one of the coolest people ever. If any of the phrases we've been using, like asymptomatic carriers, positive diagnosis, or getting tested, feel familiar, the connection has not been lost on me either. We've all had endless conversations about the coronavirus at this point, and it's changed how we navigate personal and social boundaries. Ella Dawson has seized the moment as a teachable one.
I've been having conversations about safer practices in the context of my sexual relationships with someone who has an STI. And it's been kind of fun to teach my family and my friends how to have these uncomfortable conversations about risk assessment and how you're socializing and the choices that you're making. So my hope is that while we don't really know yet how COVID will impact the way that we feel about STIs, that we all might learn some useful language and conversation skills that we can bring to the safer sex that we'll be having in the future.
As we celebrate the brilliant scientific minds that developed the COVID vaccines under immense pressure, folks in the herpes activism community remind us that a herpes vaccine would be a game changer. But finding one has proved challenging. After 4 decades of research, a vaccine still hasn't made it beyond the final stages of clinical trials. So while scientists continue that work, it's up to us to prevent and treat herpes as a community, just like we've done with the coronavirus. And Dr. Peter Leone's observation that disclosure contributes to herpes prevention sticks with me. If we just talk about this thing we're so scared of, we can make ourselves healthier and find opportunities for more love, not less. My thanks to Kaya Finlay for producing this episode and to Charlie Shelton Ormond for editing. Thanks also to Weaver Street Market, a worker and consumer-owned cooperative selling organic and local food at 4 Triangle locations in North Carolina. Now featuring online shopping with next-day pickup. weaverstreetmarket.coop. Embodied is a production of North Carolina Public Radio WUNC, a listener-supported station. If you want to lend your support to this podcast and WUNC's other shows on demand, consider a contribution at WUNC.org now. Incredible storytelling like you hear on Embodied is only possible because of listeners like you. Lindsay Foster Thomas is Embodied's chief evangelist, also known as WUNC's director of content. Every episode of this show sounds great because of sound engineer Jenny Lawson. And your head is bobbing right now because of Quilla, who wrote our wonderful theme music. I'm Anita Rao on an exploration of our brains, our bodies, and taking on the taboo with you.